Now here's Michael Foot, who only flew back from Brussels this morning.
Called on this occasion, and I must thank the Prime Minister for that decision. I can well understand also the anxieties and impatience of many of my friends on the backbenches who voted in the division a few minutes ago and who desire to have full and proper time to examine all the aspects of this question. And I will return to that aspect of the matter in a few minutes before I conclude. However, I would first of all wish to set on record as clearly as I possibly can what we believe to be the international rights and wrongs of this matter, because I believe one of the purposes of this House being assembled on this occasion is to make that clear, not only, of course, to our people in our country, but to people throughout the world. The rights and the circumstances of the people in the Falkland Islands must be the matter uppermost in our minds. There is no question in the Falkland Islands of any colonial dependence or anything of the sort. It is a question of people who wish to be associated with this country, who have built their whole lives on the basis of association with this country, and we have a moral duty, a political duty, and every other kind of duty to ensure that that is sustained. The people of the Falkland Islands have the absolute right to look to us at this moment of their desperate plight, just as they've looked to us over the past 150 years. What they are faced with is an act of naked, unqualified aggression carried out in the most shameful and disreputable circumstances. Any guarantee from this invading force is utterly worthless as any of the guarantees that are given by this same Argentinian junta to its own people. We can hardly forget that thousands of innocent people fighting for their political rights in the Argentine are in prison and have been tortured and have been debased. And we cannot forget that fact when our friends and fellow citizens in the Falkland Islands are suffering as they are at this moment. And so on the merits of the matter, we hope that the question is understood throughout the whole world. In that respect, I believe the government was right to take the matter to the United Nations. It would have been delinquency if they had not, because that is the forum where we have agreed that such matters of international right and international claim shall be stated. And I believe that the British government, whatever else it does, I come to that in a moment, whatever else it has done or not done, of course it was essential to take our case to the United Nations and to present it with all the force and powers and advocacy at the command of this country. And the decision and the vote in the United Nations is to take place, I suppose, in an hour or two's time. I must say to people there, we in this country as a whole, irrespective of our party affiliations, will examine the votes in the United Nations most carefully. Most carefully. I was very interested to hear how strongly the President of France spoke out earlier this morning, and I hope that every other country in the world would speak in the same way. If indeed at the United Nations this afternoon no such declaration were made, I know it would only be first of all a declaration, but there may be the possibilities of action there later. But if no such declaration were made, not merely would it be a gross injury to the rights of the Falkland Islands, not merely would it be an injury to the people of this country who have a right to have their claims upheld in the United Nations, but it would be a serious injury to the United Nations itself, and it would enhance the dangers that similar unprovoked aggressions could occur in other parts of the world, which is one of the reasons why we are so determined to see that we examine this matter to the full and that we uphold the rights of our country throughout the world and the claim of our country to be a defender of people's freedom throughout the world, particularly those who've looked to us for special protection, as the people in the Falkland Islands do. Now I have to turn to the government's conduct in the matter. What has happened to British diplomacy? The account given by the Right Honourable Lady when she managed to rise above some of her own party arguments. That was not the exclusive part of her speech. But her explanations are not very full and not very clear, and they will need to be made a good deal more ample in the days to come. There was the response given by Lord Carrington, the Foreign Secretary, at his press conference yesterday that I quote, although the Right Honourable Lady has not quoted it fully. She referred to the Minister of State, and this is the quotation from Lord Carrington, had just been in New York discussing with Mr. Ross, his opposite number, the question of resumption of talks with the Argentine government about the problems of the Falkland Islands. And they had had a talk and come to an agreement. Mr. Ross went back to the Argentine and a number of things came up and they sent a message which, and as I emphasize the words, I have not yet had time to reply to. So there was every reason to suppose, he went on, that the Argentines were interested in negotiations. And those talks were on the 27th of February. Now, the Right Honourable Lady gave an account of these negotiations. But from what has happened, it seems that the British government has been fooled by the way in which the Argentine junta has gone about their business. And the government must answer for that, as well as everything else. What about the question of British communications and British intelligence? Because it does enter into it. I'm using it in the technical term. In The Guardian. The Guardian said yesterday, says today in its leading article, the country devotes a greater proportion of its annual output to its armed forces than any other Western country, with the exception of the United States. It has extensive diplomatic and intelligence gathering activities. And all of that gave Mrs. Thatcher, Lord Carrington, and Mr. Knott precisely no effective cards when the Argentine Navy moved. I must say I would be very surprised to hear that in some of the previous debates and discussions and crises that have arisen with the Argentine, that British governments previously didn't have better intelligence than that. Indeed, so good was our intelligence that the invasion took place, as the Prime Minister now tells us, at 10 a.m. yesterday. And what was the exact time when the Lord Privy Seal, I know he's apologized for some of his remarks, but what about this? When he said to the House of Commons and the British people, we are taking appropriate military and diplomatic measures to sustain our rights under international law and in accordance with the provisions of the United Nations Charter. When he was saying that, it was the Argentine government that was taking appropriate military, not diplomatic measures to enforce their will. And therefore I say that the Right Honourable Lady and the Minister of Defence and the whole government will have to make a very full account of what happened and how the diplomacy was conducted and why it was that we didn't have the information that we're entitled to have when expenditure takes place on such a scale. But above all, more important than the question of what happened to British diplomacy or what happened to British intelligence is what happened to our power to act. Now, the Right Honourable Lady seems to dismiss it, but it cannot be dismissed. Of course, this country has the power to act, and the power to act very often short of taking military measures. Indeed, we've always been told, and I understand it, that the purpose of having some military powers is to deter. So what is the right to deter and the capacity to deter? Both in this situation were required. Now, I recall to the House again, and I say this because it compresses what was the incident, the major incident in these matters, because the previous government had to deal with the same kind of dictatorial regime in the Argentine, the same kind of threat to the people of the Falkland Islands, the same kind of problems that the Right Honourable and Honourable gentlemen have had to wrestle with over these last weeks and months. But my Right Honourable friend, the member for Cardiff South East, compressed the whole of this position into the question that he put to the government only Tuesday of a few days ago. And I read it all to the House, and I ask the House to mark every word in it.
He's referring to a question Mr. Callaghan asked.
I support the government, he said. Here was no factious opposition. Here was an opposition seeking to sustain the government if the government was doing its duty. I support the government's attempts to solve the problem by diplomatic means, which is clearly the best and most sensible way of approaching the problem. But is the Minister aware that there have been other recent occasions when the Argentinians, when beset by internal troubles, have tried the same type of tactical diversion? Is the Minister aware that on a very recent occasion, of which I have full knowledge, Britain assembled ships which had been stationed in the Caribbean, Gibraltar, and in the Mediterranean, and stood then about 400 miles off the Falklands in support of HMS Endurance, and that when this fact became known, without fuss and publicity, a diplomatic solution followed. And he goes on, while I do not press the Minister on what is happening today, I trust that it is the same sort of action. And the whole country and the whole House had the right to say that same thing to the government.
Labour chairs.
And the people of the Falkland Islands had even greater right to say it than we've had. And the Right Honourable Lady hasn't answered. She's hardly given an attempt to answer that question. It is no answer to refer to the matter which was so effectively disposed of by my right honourable friend, the member for Merthyr Tydfil, who had quite a lot of knowledge of these matters. Of course, it's a very different question. Now, nobody can say for certain, of course not, that the pacific and honourable solution of this problem that was reached in 1977 was due to the combination of diplomatic and military activity. Nobody can say that for certain because these things cannot be proved. But there's every likelihood that that was the case. And in any case, it having worked on the previous occasion, surely that was all the more reason that the government should have sought to make it work on this occasion. Particularly when the Foreign Secretary, and I referred again to the diplomatic exchanges, when it had been going on for some time. And when, according to the diplomatic exchanges, the Argentine government was still awaiting an answer from the Foreign Secretary on some of the matters involved. Surely, that interval, the Right Honourable Lady made some play, but not, I don't think, very effectively, with the time it takes to get warships into the area. But we are talking now about a period of several weeks ago. Several weeks ago. So all those matters have to be answered. In my opinion, they cannot be answered, of course, fully in this debate. We shall have to have another debate on the subject next week. Whether that debate takes the form of a vote of censure, or whether it takes another form, or whether it immediately takes the form of the establishment of an inquiry into the whole matter so that all the evidence and all the facts can be laid before the people of this country. At some stage, I haven't the slightest doubt that an inquiry of that nature, one that is absolutely without any inhibitions and restraints and that can probe the matter to the full, at some stage, that will have to be undertaken. I return, however, to what I said at the beginning. We are paramountly concerned. I'm sure the bulk of this House is paramountly concerned, and I'm sure the country is concerned with what we may do to protect those who've rightly and naturally looked to us for our protection. So far, they have been betrayed, and the responsibility for the betrayal rests with the government. The government.
Chairs from the Labour side.
The government must now prove by deeds, because they'll never be able, I believe, to do it by words, that they are not responsible and they cannot face that charge. That is the charge that I believe does lie against them, and I repeat and underline. even though it is the position and circumstances of the people who live in the Falkland Islands that are uppermost in our minds, and it would be outrageous if that were not the case. There is also the longer interest that we should not see foul, brutal aggression successful in our world. If that happens, it can be a danger not merely to the Falkland Islands, but to people all over this dangerous planet of ours.
Mr. Foote has just sat down. A large number of MPs are just standing up, but there's very loud cheers from the Labour side. He's just